Hi guys, and welcome back to another fly fishing video. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for coming back, and if you're new to the channel, my name's Lindsay and I make fly fishing and fly tying videos. Well, already many of the large still waters have opened their doors to anglers, and what I want to do today is list 5 flies and the tactics we're going to use to fish them to get your season off to a successful start. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So before we kick off our list of flies, it's worth mentioning that a number of our large reservoirs won't be opening its doors to anglers this year. Fishery Management Limited, following the tragic passing of Ifor Jones on the 16th of January, will not be opening its doors this season. This affects Draycott, Ibrook and Thornton reservoirs. I can only hope that new backers come to the rescue of these outstanding fisheries that have been such a mainstay for many anglers across the country. My sympathy goes out to the staff that made these fisheries what they were. It will obviously cause some disruption across the competition scene, with organisers scrambling to fit fixtures into other venues. With rising costs across the board, times are tough, and the Stillwater scene has never been in more need of support. Fishing is definitely a luxury, and it is a privilege, but if you can afford to go, please do your best to support your local fisheries. Anyway, enough of the doom and gloom. Let's get on with our list of 5 flies, and we'll start with number 1. The orange blob. I know it's boring. The reality is though, the orange blob is probably one of, if not the most effective stillwater fly. Takes fish all year round, but particularly early season, the orange blob's a great fly to have on your cast. Now the blob comes in all shapes and sizes, and although I say orange blob, there's lots of different colour combinations. There's tequila blobs, there's the pink death, there's certainly plenty to choose from. It's primarily used as an attractor fly, but it can be fished in other ways. So what do I mean by an attractor pattern? From a boat generally, most anglers will fish a team of flies between 3 and 4. Now the orange blob can be attached to the top dropper with drabber, more realistic patterns in behind it. So such as cormorants, crunchers, that kind of thing. Fish will come in to investigate the orange blob, and very often they will take that on the top dropper. But if they refuse it and they turn down, they might take one of the more natural patterns. So first off, I would fish it primarily as an attractor pattern. Of course, the other way of doing it, when the fish are really on the hunt, I would fish 2 blobs, and I would do that on a variety of lines between a DI3 down to a DI7. And basically I would have 6 to 8 feet to my first dropper, which would be a bright orange or a tequila type blob, and then 10 feet away from that I would fish a black blob, sometimes with a sparkly tail, and that can be devastating. If you pull flies like this through a shoal of fish, very often you can end up with 2 fish on your cast, which is a good thing in competition. It can be a bad thing. If they're strong fish, they can snap you up if you get a double shooter, but a very effective way of fishing the orange blob. One of the other ways then, and I think it's kind of slipped into the shadows over recent years, is Peter Appleby's way of fishing a single orange blob. So how he does it is his favourite line's a DI5, but it can be fished on a DI3, DI7, whatever line you like. It depends on where the fish are in the water column. Basically, it's 20 foot of the minimum diameter of tippet you're prepared to go to. 5 pounds is not uncommon for me to use with a single fly. It might not seem very heavy, but when you've only got one fly connected to your fly line, it's incredibly strong. You've got to be wary that you are fishing with 5 pound, but fishing 20 foot of that with an orange blob attached, and you can mix that retrieve up. Peter liked to do short, sharp pulls. He used to fish in a team with Peter, and watching him doing it, it's unbelievable. It's just different level. He would know when a fish was following his flies, and he would hang at real distance. So he'd have a 20 foot marker on his fly line, and he'd hold it at the tip, and the fish would be taken 40 feet away from the boat. It's a devastating method on its day, and definitely worth having in your back pocket. Number 2 then, the cormorant. Once the fish have seen all the glitz and glamour of blobs and sparkly flies, the cormorant can score big time. You can fish it very slowly using a figure of 8 retrieve with an intermediate line. Again, it all depends where the fish are in the water column. I tend to fish cormorants in teams of 3. I would have them 5 foot apart with 10 foot to my first dropper. And the reason I would have 10 foot to the first dropper, if I wanted to change fly lines because I didn't quite have the depth correct, I can wind my flies all the way into the reel, simply attach the new fly line, change it quickly with a cassette reel, and I'm fishing at a deeper level or a higher level, as the case may be. The cormorant's also an excellent fly for fishing in between your blobs. So we talked about the orange blob initially. I would fish a couple of cormorants in a team of 4 and be very confident that they would take fish. A typical setup for me would be an orange blob on the top dropper and 2 cormorants in behind it. Fish will often come in behind the blob and then turn and take the drabber cormorant pattern. There are so many variations of this pattern I couldn't even begin to list them, but the original, which was a peacock herald body and just a black wing, is still as devastating as the day it was created. Number 3 then, the humble buzzer, or chironomids as our friends across the pond like to call them. It is one of the most important food items on the trout's menu. Again, they come in all shapes and sizes. Now, in years gone by, I wouldn't be expecting to fish buzzers very much until probably later on into April. But as the climate seems to be changing over the years, we're getting much warmer weather in March, and the buzzer hatches can be in full flow as early as the last couple of weeks of March. And you can always catch fish on buzzers throughout the year. I have lots of variations on buzzers in my fly boxes, but I always find myself drifting back to what I call the Barker buzzer. It's just a very simple affair. It's a black buzzer, stripped peacock herald body, and it has yellow goose biots in at the head to create the thorax. And it's just very easy to tie, it's very simple, but it can be very effective. Now, that you'll get the debate of whether buzzers should be tied on curved hooks or straight hooks. I have them on both varieties. If I'm fishing buzzers under a bung, I would fish curved hooks. I just prefer it, fishing them statically. If I'm fishing them in a team for washing line, for example, I would tie on straight hooks for my buzzers. Well, let's briefly talk about how we would fish buzzers. So I mentioned earlier there, the bung. It might be a dirty word to some people. To me, it's just another string to my bow. If fish want the flies fished completely static, I don't believe there's a better way of fishing for trout than an indicator. Now, that said, that does have its restrictions. You're limited to a certain depth that you can fish to. Sometimes you're just not getting down to the fish. So the only other way of doing it is straight lining. Now, how I would set up for straight lining my buzzers would be a 22-foot leader. I would have a very heavy buzzer on the point, and then I would have 4 flies up, and they would be 4 feet apart. Again, I'd be able to change my fly line because I'd have 10 foot of tippet between my fly line and my first buzzer. You can change to midge tips, you can fish buzzers on intermediate lines, despite what people tell you. One of the other ways you can score heavily with buzzers, of course, is fishing them on a washing line setup. And if you're not sure what that is, I'll stick a little link up in the corner here where you can have a look after you watch this video, of course. So far so good. I'd just like to pause for a moment to ask you to give the video a like. Consider subscribing to the channel. It's absolutely free and you can unsubscribe at any time. It really does help YouTube to identify that you're enjoying the content, and it encourages me to make more videos. So let's jump straight back in with number 3. The booby. It seems to have dropped back a bit in popularity, and this is because the advent of the fab, which is the foam-arshed blob. People tend to use them as attractor patterns and flies to fish the washing line. I'm still a great fan of the booby. I've got a number of different ways of fishing it. I still like to use a booby when I'm fishing washing line rather than a fab. And very often what I would do is I would have a blob on the top dropper, maybe a cormorant, cruncher perhaps in between, and on the point I would have a booby. Invariably it would be either a candy floss booby or a gold arsed cat booby, but that's the kind of setup I would be looking at. It's good for washing line, but where I find it really scores is fished on its own. When the fishing's really tough, I would fish a single booby on 10 foot of tippet, and again I would go really low in diameter with my tippet material. And this is not because I think the fish see fluorocarbon, it's because of the way the fly behaves in the water when it's being fished. When it's being fished very slowly, you can just imagine the movement you're getting from that single fly. There's nothing else on the cast to interfere with the way the fly is fishing, and it can be absolutely devastating. And I owe quite a lot of my successful matches to fishing this method. I would fish it in years gone by when the season started. It was much colder than it is nowadays. I would always get my DI7 or even a DI8 if I thought it was necessary to get the fly right down to the bottom. Another reason for this that might have escaped some people, but it certainly didn't escape me, at the beginning of the season, the larger fish will be, generally speaking, on the bottom. And there'll be another layer of fish, the freshly stocked fish, that will be above them. Now, if you're not fishing down through them smaller fish, you're not getting your chance to get your flies to where the better fish are. So very often, getting that single fly, you've got more chance of getting through the recently stocked fish to the better overwintered fish. So number 5, and the last fly, but certainly not least. Now, in years gone by, this fly would not have made my early season list. I would be reaching for the crunchers around the end of April, beginning of May, when the fish are starting to move up into the upper layers of the water column, taking food items at that depth. But now, again, we go back to the change in climate. Fish are coming up higher and higher in the water, and it's not unusual to find you're catching in the first 3 or 4 feet even as early as the 1st of April. So crunchers, they come in a variety of different types. My favourite has got to be the black cruncher with a UV thorax. I really have a lot of success with that, but the original with just ordinary natural pheasant tail works extremely well for me as well. By the very nature of the fly, it's designed to fish high in the water. It's got that hackle that's going to slow its descent down. It's got a nice bushy tail that's going to just keep it right up in the layers, the upper layers of the water. So if you feel that the fish are in the top layers of water, I would be much more inclined to tie on cruncher patterns than buzzers, which will descend much quicker in the water column, taking you out of the feeding zone. If I'm fishing a straightforward team of crunchers, I do like to fish them on a midge tip, just breaking the surface immediately. And you can fish them, you can stroke them back, you can fish them very slow figure of 8, and if you have the skill set from a drifting boat to fish them statically, the takes can be devastating. Well, next week I'm off chasing steelhead in Michigan, but when I come back I'll have a few early season matches lined up, and these are some of the flies and tactics I'll be using to try and catch some fish. Now, if you would like to learn more about fishing chironomids or buzzers, check out this video here. And I'll see you all in the next one.